Power to the people pleasers. I'm so excited to have my guest, DK Ciccone, here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm so excited that you are here today because you reached out, having listened to the podcast, and have such a powerful message. You get why we're here. Power to the people pleasers, and the reality that many of us actually can relate to being a people pleaser. And I'd love to know, before we
Mm.
get started, have you ever been a people pleaser, and how did that show up in your life?
Yeah, so of course I contemplated this quite a bit, knowing that this would come up. I think, like many of your guests, people pleasing has been a part of my identity since my very young years. Um, in addition to being an only child in an environment where I think I was often playing the kind of peacemaker role with my parents and trying to kind of neutralize the situation, I think I learned how to be really in tune with how people around me were feeling, and then try to um, do whatever it took to kind of get them to be happy with me. And I mean, like, as a kid, you don't really understand like what the dynamic has to do with you. And
Mm.
um, at the same time, I was raised in a really an evangelical Christian household, and so there were a lot of um, expectations that were set from a very young age about the way we are showing up in an effort to please a higher power and also achieve a certain, standard of living with other humans. And also, there was just really this emphasis on kind of being a different female in the appropriate role dynamic. So I think those things together really laid the foundation for me. Um, but when I was thinking about this question and how I would answer it, it got me really thinking, because I always talk about how empathy is my superpower,
Yeah.
and how I didn't really recognize that as a superpower when I was in a corporate world, which is what I did before Pilates. Empathy was seen as really a liability. The fact that I couldn't have a confrontational conversation without having a thicker skin, was seen as something I
Mm.
needed to work on in my performance development. But in my current role, working exclusively with folks who are in chronic pain, being able to sense their emotions is an asset. So I do think that being able to tune in to folks and how they're feeling as an empath is kind of like one half of the people pleasing dynamic.
Mm.
But then the second half of it is then altering the way that you act in an effort to achieve a standard that's externally defined, whether it's in your behavior or um, how you define yourself, the words you choose, the actions you take. And then you end up sort of, and I think one of your recent guests said, sort of like handing too much of your power over to
Yeah.
that person. And so I feel like I don't know that I would even call myself a recovering people pleaser, because I think my people pleasing is probably part of my nature, and I don't know if it'll ever go away. And I don't want to lose that first half. So I really
Mhm.
think it comes to, how do we protect ourselves from the second half, either where we
Yes.
inadvertently put ourselves in situations where we're handing our power over to someone else, or we come into contact with a human being who actually senses that tendency in us and exploits it for their means. So
Mm.
those are my thoughts on people pleasing at the moment.
I love it. I love it. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And I love that you shared that you're an empath and the relationship that has with your business. We're going to go there a little bit further, but I wanted to highlight that you are now a Pilates for pain specialist, focusing
Yes.
on individuals who are post rehab or with chronic conditions. And you shared, I want you to share about your own chronic story if you're open. You have a beautiful studio in Boston, Massachusetts, where you support people there. And you have a book coming out in December,
I do.
A Guide to Conquering Chronic Pain, Increasing Stress Resilience, and Reclaiming an Active Life in December. So that is super exciting. And when you have that link, you can send it to me so I can update the show
Awesome.
with
Thank you.
that link. That's so exciting.
Yeah, thanks. It's an exciting journey.
Mhm, mhm. So I'd love to dig in a little bit more to your experience with chronic pain and how you actually got to Pilates as a supportive tool for you.
Yeah, sure. So my chronic pain story started quite young, actually. I was only 13, And I was dancing really regularly at the time. I had dreams of going into musical theater
Wow.
when I grew up. That was my, be on Broadway was my dream.
Wow.
And I actually had a sort of out of nowhere a really a surprising back spasm in the middle of a performance of a musical called Godspell,
Wow.
with a local theater company. And it, kind of took my breath away and kind of sent that lightning bolt, that like classic lightning bolt feeling up my back. And then I ended up, after the performance, icing and heat packs and lying on the living room floor with my legs up and just being kind of like, what is going on, right? And so,
Mhm.
my parents did their best to try to figure out, how to help. I mean, of course, as a 13-year-old, and I had no car accident. Like, there was no reason to think that there was anything structurally really wrong.
Yeah.
So we all just kind of assumed it was like a muscle spasm of some kind, but there was really no understanding of what caused it. But that kind of played out as a pattern through my teenage years, and it would come and go, and it would be the same thing, like 3 to 7 days of just being really uncomfortable, and then it would subside, ice and heat and whatever, going to a chiropractor. And I never really figured it out. I did eventually have to put dancing on a shelf because
Mm.
it was just like too inconsistent. It was too inconsistent. I couldn't show up in the way I wanted to.
Yeah.
And then later on in my 20s, I started experiencing another really bad flare up of pain in my low back, slightly different. It was on like kind of less electric. And that one led to me entering the healthcare system and so on. And I had an MRI, and I was diagnosed with a disc herniation.
Mm.
And that period of lying with my legs up lasted about 18 months.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a really long period of healing, and goodness, I could go on and on forever. And of course, a lot of my stories in the book, it's a lot of personal stories in the book, but
Mm.
I tried everything that was thrown at me. Like most people on a chronic pain journey, you hop and hop from to specialist, trying to figure out what's going to give you relief. And it was really time eventually for the tissues to heal. And still, even at a 25 or 26, I was still really young,
Yeah.
to be having these kinds of symptoms. And so when I wanted to get moving again, because moving was a huge part of my identity, and when I felt like I could be really expressing my authentic self, even though
Yeah.
I wasn't on stage anymore. Um, Someone said, well, why don't you give Pilates a try? I've heard, that's a
Mm.
movement thing you could try. And I've heard it's safe and good for backs. And I said, great. And I was living in New Haven, Connecticut at the time, and there was a mat studio there. And it was almost immediate in terms of my relief. And I do think
Wow.
some of that was the fact that there's a big breathing component. And
Yeah.
so there was probably a nervous system, calming component. There was also just like the joy that comes from the
Mhm.
chemical release of moving. But, it is a very safe supported modality in the body. Like there's not really a lot of opportunities for joint strain. So then I started, regularly using Pilates like throughout my years, in during flare-ups and so on. And it was really when my pain and my challenges with anxiety kind of
Mm.
hit each other in a big intersection later
Interesting.
in my 30s, that
Wow.
I said, you know what? I need to find a thing that really lights me up, where I can show up as my authentic self, where my empathy is an asset,
Yeah.
and people aren't trying to get me to show up as something else. And it led me to being a teacher and working with this population I feel so passionately about. And so that's how I got to where I am right now.
Wow. Wow. Well, I think it's important that we share these stories so when people are hearing, there's that their pain can have a different reality, that they can find ways to connect to feeling better. I love that.
Mhm.
I love that, and
Mhm.
that they're not alone in this, right? And I
Mm.
loved your vulnerability and openness around the intersection around with the anxiety as well.
Yeah.
So interesting. So, okay, I'd love to know a little bit more about you see a direct link with chronic pain and people pleasing. Can you share a little bit more so people might be able to better identify is that something that's happening for them?
Sure. And I would recommend also a fantastic book called The Way Out by Alan Gordon. So
Yeah.
I participated in a training called Pain Reprocessing Therapy,
Mhm.
and he leads the Pain Psychology Center, which is located in California. And there's also a section in there about characteristics that lead to this kind of persistent, neuropathic pain. And I won't go into or
Yeah.
neuroplastic pain. Um, but but essentially, when you have that characteristic of being a people pleaser, you often have other things that go with it, like a self criticism, a hypervigilance, probably an overloaded nervous system because you're kind of sponging up the stresses around you. You're taking on other people's emotions as a responsibility that you have
Yeah.
for fixing those feelings. Maybe there's a traumatic, situation in your past in which you have, a fight or flight response that's a little bit um, overactive or even stuck. And so those folks end up more likely to end up in a cycle of chronic pain. And
Yeah.
that's because the pain at its very basic description is when the brain decides that you are in danger in some
Mm.
way. It's a and when I think one of the hardest things for me as part of this journey of self-discovery and trying to kind of like 3 decades of trying to figure out, how do I make pain like how
Yeah.
do I make this a thing that's in my life in the background instead of always taking the driver's seat? Is recognizing that pain is a good thing. If you didn't have pain, your risk of mortality would be so much higher.
Yes.
So, pain is an evolved response in the body to alert us to something that's wrong. You would certainly want something in your body to tell you to take your hand out of a flame. That would be a good response to have. The challenge is that we sense fears all around us, we sense threats all around us, and so that kind of panicked, hypervigilant, behavior that often comes with a people-pleasing nature, or like I said, the trauma of neglect or avoidance or something in your childhood that led to a people-pleasing response, is living there in the body. I mean, I know The Body Keeps the Score is like a super
Mm.
popular book at the time or at this time. And I think it's awesome that people are reading that because, for so long we've not taken into consideration what having unprocessed, unresolved emotional experiences underneath the surface is doing to the nervous system. And the
Yeah.
nervous system is what alerts you to pain. And I know that this is true because, going after, like I said, that kind of anxiety, pain collision that happened for
Mhm.
me
Yeah.
was tied to me feeling like I was being asked to show up as an inauthentic version of myself. And I think that as a people pleaser, that's just really common because you're chameleoning all the time and you're trying to solve other people's needs. And so, having to accept that was kind of a challenge for me. But, I started to recognize it. And then when I started working with populations in pain, the thing that just comes up over and over and over again is the fear
Yeah.
and the kind of ways in which they've been prioritizing other people's needs over their own. And then once they make that commitment to prioritizing their health, and once they get themselves in a situation where movement is not a fearful or fear-inducing situation anymore, the pain goes away.
Yeah.
And that, or it becomes, just kind of like I like to say, it's like a static in the background. I
Mhm.
mean, you know,
It's
it's
there, but
it
it's not like the only thing that you're able to experience.
right.
Right.
And
Okay.
someone else I think was saying, it comes like a neutral, and it's like a neutral sensation.
Right.
And again, Alan Gordon talks about that in his book as well. It's like we have sensations all the time, and your brain is making a decision if this is a threatening situation, like a tickle on your arm. Is that a threatening
Yes.
situation or sensation, or is it really pain? And so when you've experienced those fearful situations over and over again, your brain may become kind of like uncalibrated to
Mhm.
a soft touch or, something like a stretch in your body. I would have people who first come to see me call that a pain, and it's really
Mm.
a stretch, and for some people that feels very soothing and safe.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think, and not to just to go on too long here, but I think another big part of this is that when you're a people pleaser, you tend to disconnect from your physical body because you're so tuned into the needs of other people that I think we kind of put things in the back burner.
Yes.
Um, and the inability to connect with your physical body, the inability to actually pick up on early warning signs that your stress levels are high, that you're, I think of certainly what we went through with COVID, and so many people were just kind of like heads down, just let's just work, let's just, pretend that this looming threat
Giant
isn't
thing.
happening. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? That causes you to sort of disconnect from your body. And I also talk separately, and I don't know if this is necessarily a component of people pleasing, but I also have a hypothesis that chronic dieting is another thing that can make you a greater risk of having chronic pain for the very same reason that if you
Yeah.
ignore your hunger cues and you put yourself in a position of restriction, you're basically telling your body, hey, that hunger thing that you are evolutionarily programmed to tell me is a thing that should
Take
provoke
care
me
of.
to go eat for my
Yeah.
survival. Like, I'm telling you, that's a signal I no longer want to listen to.
Mm.
And so then you're sort of shutting out all of your body's attempts to communicate with you.
Yeah.
And so, so much of my book and just my work with clients is just even like being able to embody your vessel in a way that's trusting and supportive, and where it's okay to say, like, what I need in this moment is it can be the priority, and that's all right. Like, it's actually
Yes.
healthy and good.
Yes. Oh my goodness, so many powerful things. I'm like taking notes of all the like, yes, let's go back to that. Okay, so I'd love to know your experience as an empath. You mentioned, and I'm summarizing, to body communication, where people
Mhm.
are, listening. I'm summarizing that whole piece there into the words body communication. How does being an empath help you support people reconnect to that body communication?
Yeah. That's an awesome question. I think because I'm always watching people move from the lens of what's happening underneath the surface. And I'm looking for the I can't moments. Because the I can't moments are those kind of entry points to transformation for chronic pain, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the equivalent of exposure therapy for someone who's afraid of snakes or,
Yeah.
anything. It's an exposure to whatever trigger is causing your pain. And people don't necessarily even notice that they're having those moments. Sometimes it's very profound and, they're
Yeah.
like, no, I can't do this.
Hmm.
But other times I'm watching, like, facial tics, or I'm watching to see if the fists are clenching, and I'm sensing how the energy in the room changes. Like, even if they suddenly become short with me, um,
Mm.
I really take that as like, okay, we're getting into something that's making your nervous system bark back with a little bit of fear. And so I think the ability to sense that is definitely tied to being an empath.
Yeah.
It also means I have to learn to flush whatever that is after the fact, and I'm still
Yeah.
learning that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's a big part of it for sure.
Wow. Wow. So in our conversation where we met, you and even in your introduction today of where people pleasing has come for you, you talk about two sides of people pleasing. And one of the things that you brought up when we had met was around creating boundaries. I'd love if
Mm.
you can share what are your couple tips that you might give to your clients around creating boundaries that support getting back, getting to a place of the pain not being forefront.
Yeah, boundaries, right? A
Mhm.
lifelong a lifelong endeavor,
Yep.
honestly. And one of the things I think that came up when we first spoke, that was a real awakening for me in my experience. So, reading and just trying to figure all this out is when you get to these questions in these books or whatever, and they're like, write down what you really desire. And then you're just sit there and you go like blank page. Like, you're like,
Yep.
You're like, you might be a people pleaser if someone asks you what you want and you just go like blank. So I think that that's step one. Like, I think you do
Yeah.
have to know. And one of the most powerful things, and goodness, at this point, I can't remember the source, but one of the most powerful things for me was setting a core set of values, of 5
Mm.
personal values. And I actually do talk about this in the book too, like as a first step of, if you know what your core values are, it helps as a rule, like a ruler against which to make decisions for your
Yes.
time.
Yes.
And I would ask, if your own health and well-being doesn't show up in your core values, that's a question that I would like to dive into with a person, because
Mhm.
literally we only have this one vessel and it's the thing that makes living possible. So hopefully it falls in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, the other two things I are about, especially when it comes to movement, is to really not have a non-negotiable in terms of your time. And I'm surely we all hear this from people, but I would say that it's more important that it be daily, and 5 minutes than,
Mm.
3 times a week in an hour, because
Yes.
then it really becomes something that breaks up the cycle of the stress. And also just, you will start to become habitualized to the chemical response in such a way that you might crave it, but it might be
Mhm.
a challenge at first. And then if you're a people pleaser, I would suspect that maybe you are also what Gretchen Rubin would call an obliger, which
Mm.
is her the book, The Four Tendencies, which is that book that talks about ability to hold ourselves accountable to things.
Yeah.
And so I definitely identify as someone where, if there's external accountability, meaning somebody's relying on me to do something, like, not even a question in my mind, I will be there. If internally I set an accountability, like I'm going to get up at 5:30 and journal or something, I will never do it. Like,
Mm.
it doesn't even matter. I mean, I have a room full of equipment and like I have to set boundaries with myself to make sure I get in here.
Yeah.
So I think being true with yourself about what is your accountability framework that works for you,
Yes.
and figuring out a structure that allows you to do that. And so for me, someone who's like has an external accountability, like having someone who texts me at 10 a.m. every day and says, you know, did you do your workout today? Or having a buddy to walk with,
Yes.
enlisting or deciding to forego an expense over here because I'm going to pay for a personal trainer, not because it's a luxury and I think I'm like
Yeah.
I'm indulging, but because literally I need that to show up.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be really honest with ourselves about what habit change requires, and then just remember your why. Like, remember why you're doing this. And it's, if you even want to put it in the lens of, listen, DK, this is all really great, but I'm a mom right now and a career person, and I'm up for promotion, and I have 800 people depending on me in my, this
Yeah.
is for later. I think I would just remind you that you are going to show up as the very best version of yourself if you prioritize your health and fill your own cup.
Yes.
And if I would argue, people might debate me, but I would argue that if you had to pick a single health promoting behavior out of all of the ones that are available,
Mm.
regular movement is the number one. And it affects all of the systems of the body in terms of improvement. It affects your mental health. I mean, ditch the supplements, girlfriend, ditch the cleanses or whatever else. Get your body moving and you won't regret it.
Yes, yes. Well, and you know what I love that the way that you're describing movement, I always call it movement also, not exercise,
Yeah.
because of the stories that many people tell themselves about the word exercise, right? I love that you use the word movement also. And I love also what you said about 5 minutes is better than 0, right? Like, let's get into that frame of mind of, if I have a couple of minutes to stand up and move my body while at work,
Mhm.
or in between. I even talk about, these busy soccer moms. What are you doing after you've dropped the kid off for that hour-long wait between
Mhm.
when they have to be there and when the game actually starts? Can we use these pockets of time in our life to actually help ourselves feel better, right? Like,
Yes.
this idea of just not having it to be this perfect, it has to be a certain way
To
mindset.
count.
Oh my
It
gosh.
only counts if you sweat
It only
XYZ, right?
counts. Yeah, does this
Yeah, it drives me
count?
nuts.
I'm like,
Right.
"What do you mean?"
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
this has been a
you know what?
lovely
And, like, also, I
conversation.
just wanna say, I think if you are feeling that way, if folks who are listening do, like, struggle with those feelings,
Mhm.
like, this is not your fault. This is social
Yeah,
conditioning. This is the really wealthy diet culture industry that has built up marketing around making you feel terrible about yourself.
that it's
So,
not enough. Yep.
caring for yourself is an act of rebellion, and so it's not gonna be easy, but we can make a movement, and I'm like, a movement in 2 ways. I mean, I
Yeah.
really think we can make a movement around normalizing movement in our daily lives, and I
Mhm.
really advocate for that, so
That's beautiful. You're so great. So, DK, thank you so much for being on the
my
podcast.
pleasure.
People can connect with you on Instagram at movement_remedies, as well as your website is movementremedies.org. We're staying tuned for this book announcement as well, which I'm very excited for you. And I want to thank you so much for being here today.
It was my pleasure.
Amazing. And thank you so much to all of the listeners of Power to the People Pleasers. Please stay tuned for our next episode coming soon. Have a great day.